Hello, cannabis business minds, and hope you're doing well. I wanted to take a week or two off just to stand in solidarity of what is happening in the United States and the very important role that the cannabis industry can play in this discussion and should play in this discussion. I had recorded a ton of podcasts prior, and those will be getting distributed starting next Friday. What we have today is an interview with an award-winning documentarian, Windy Borman. She's most known for doing a lot of work with women in the cannabis industry. On today's podcast, we don't just talk about women and women's rights. We talk about what equity is and what parity is and what true empowerment is. How does this apply to cannabis business minds? It applies in so many different ways. It implies in how you are currently leading your company, in how you are working with people, in how you're approaching situations that might be uncomfortable. So in this interview, you're going to hear her and I go back and forth. This was recorded in March, right? So much more about gender parity and equity in general. But please try to apply this with a lens of what is happening currently in the country. What is currently happening with this revolution, and what impact you can make after listening to this episode. I would love your feedback, y'all. As always, please join me on Instagram at Cannabis Business Minds, and then also on Facebook. We've got the Roadmap to Success Facebook group where I'm actually doing the podcast live. So if you're ever interested in actually tuning in, watching me interview the guest, that actually is starting this month. So like always, take that pen out, that paper, please take some notes and think about how you can apply what you're going to learn today into your life and into your business today. At Cannabis Business Minds, we train and mentor professionals, entrepreneurs, and aspiring entrepreneurs on how to confidently find their place in the legal cannabis and hemp industries. Come on and join us at cannabisbusinessminds.com.
All right. Well, it's not every day that we get to talk with an award-winning documentary film producer and director, and today we get to. On this episode of Cannabis Business Minds, we're going to be talking to the famous Windy Borman about her journey as a filmmaker and what she'd uncovered in the cannabis industry when she decided to produce and direct the award-winning film, Women of Weed. So today we are going to talk with her about her view and everything that she has to share about what she was able to uncover in the film. It's an amazing film. I hope that everybody can watch it. And in the end of the show, we will give you some show notes where you can actually find that information.
Hi there. You got me?
Hi. I gotcha. I loved your film. It was so fantastic. You know when you go into a shop or you read a book or you watch a film, like in this case, you just feel like you can identify with all of the characters. You feel this sense of just warmth and love. And I got that from the film.
Aww.
Like I just, following your journey and really kind of how you even kind of started to dive in and then getting to know all of the other women in it. It was just such a treat to watch.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you had the experience watching it. I tried to balance it between having a story that the old guard, the OGs who were like, yeah, I've seen everything. I've been doing this for decades. Something that they would enjoy, as well as to address the questions of people like I started out just going, I have no idea. Like, I don't even know where to start, guys. And taking them on a journey together so they can kind of end up and have a conversation. And I think that's been the most rewarding thing so far in doing film screenings is the conversations people have afterwards. It usually comes down to, where do I buy it? Or what is a brand or a product that's owned by a woman or a person of color that I can support, right? And then the second part of that question is, so who do I talk to about getting something to finally treat my arthritis? Or who do I talk to about having, a family member use this or things like that? So it just starts these conversations, and it's really exciting to witness and, if I'm not there, just hear afterwards, like what the outcome becomes. And we've had some successes with that. In 2018, I think it was February, we had a screening in Oklahoma City, and a couple months later, the state decided to legalize. And I think it became really clear just at the conference where they screened the film that, they could do this, and they had the stakeholders in the room to say, okay, let's go for it.
Yeah, well, it shows, I think, what storytelling and a really good, accurate story has to do, because you've directed award-winning documentaries before getting into the cannabis industry. And offline, you told me the average documentary is about 7 years. And so when you want to create something as big as a story as this, it definitely takes some time. And I'm curious, just what made you want to get started on this project?
It really was the statistics I heard, because cannabis was on my radar. I had just moved to Colorado in 2014, but I had never tried it. A lot of people teased me that I was going to see a dispensary on every corner, and, Denver was going to smell like pot smoke constantly. And when I moved there, I didn't really know what to expect. And what I was pleasantly surprised by was all the women I saw leading this nascent industry, as it was transitioning from medical to adult use. And I just kept hearing over and over again that women had almost equal representation in the industry. And so finally in 2015, I heard the statistic that 36% of senior leadership in the cannabis industry was women. And when you look at other industries, the average is 22%. You look at tech and finance or film, it's like 12%. And so I said, well, that's interesting. Tell me more. And I realized in talking to men and women that not only was cannabis a leader for gender parity, but it was also a leader in social justice and environmental sustainability. And so those three core values tied into all my other film projects. My prior work was about elephants in Thailand and dyslexia in the United States. And I am a woman, so if I can tell a lens through a female viewpoint, I will, just because that's how I also see the world, right? So this film really tied everything together, and it was curious enough that I felt like if I could learn about cannabis from the viewpoint of these shared values, I felt like there was going to be something there. And that's just kind of the risk you take as a filmmaker. I kind of joke that my spidey senses start to tingle and there's something here, like a journalist with a story. I don't know what it is, but this is interesting. And so I just went on that journey for 18 months. And the film came out in film festivals in the fall of 2017. And it's been really interesting to see, how the country and how the world and how the industry has evolved during that time.
Oh, I know, and I'm excited to kind of get into that. And I think one of the best things that, even being in the industry and watching your film for the first time, what you emphasize and kind of what you showcase are things that I think are ever evolving. And I had never heard about the term pufferjet. And I think that is something that almost every industry needs to kind of aspire to have, this type of term. And so you kind of already segued into it, that it's gender parity, it's environmental sustainability, it's social justice. Did you know when you were getting into this documentary that you would really start seeing those aspects of the industry? Or was it when was it in the journey that you realized that this is the industry that could really flip the switch on a lot of other industries?
Well, it was a decision I made to focus on those core values before we started filming. And I was able to come to that because I pre-interviewed 100 people, men and women, to just kind of wrap my head around okay, what's going on in this state? What's going on in this state? How does this work? What's that? And I have a Google spreadsheet of all the people I talked to and notes from those conversations. And so from there, I started seeing these trends or these themes come up. And I realized that what could set my film about cannabis apart from other films was focusing on those core values. I'm not a mother. I don't have a child who's used cannabis to overcome some type of cancer. So that's not necessarily a film I could tell from a personal point of view, right? Or I have been fortunate enough to not be incarcerated because of drug use. So that wasn't a story I could tell from that personal point of view. But going into this world as a curious on-camera narrator saying, okay, but what about this? Tell me more about this. That was a story I could tell. And I just kind of trusted that the audience would want to go with me on that. I felt like it was a new enough industry that there was still kind of a base level of information I needed to communicate before we could go into some of these deeper concepts, right? And that was something that was reinforced just in the editing process. I mean, we filmed and then, sorry to peel back the layers on Hollywood, everybody, but we do test screenings on films, right? To see how are people reacting. Do we get a laugh here? Do we get people emoting? Are things falling flat? Does it feel too long? So we did a test screening, and some of the feedback I got from the rough cut was people wanted to talk about things they were already used to hearing about. They wanted to talk about kids with epilepsy, and they wanted to talk about veterans, and they wanted to talk about these things. And I realized I needed to give that to them so that way they felt like they could go on this journey too. Like, okay, well, I already know something. Okay, I'm still feeling comfortable. Wait, I have a question. Oh, good. Wendy asked the question. Yeah, tell me about that. Okay, we're still learning. We're still going. And then as a filmmaker, you also try to make it fun. When you need to find the times where you can laugh and kind of stutter in disbelief and applaud and all of those things. And so you just try to take them on this narrative arc with you.
Yeah. Well, it was such a fun journey. And what I really love about it is that anybody that watches this really has a true understanding. And of course, you can always go deeper, right? But a very true understanding of these pillars that make up the cannabis industry, why I think so many puffer jets are part of this space. I've never been in an industry that touches on all of these different themes and has such, I guess, charismatic and amazing and profound leadership that's really trying to kind of tackle some of these world's problems. So if you've nailed it on the head.
Yay, thank you.
Yes. And I'm curious, I always think about goals. So I was like, oh my gosh, so I get to interview this amazing woman. She's great at what she does. I want to hear her entrepreneur story. And I also really want to know about all the insight that she has, because you've been able to talk to so many people and so many entrepreneurs. And, Women's Month is March. And I'm curious if through all of the women entrepreneurs that you were able to highlight and the other ones that you were able to do research on, and since then that you've been able to meet, if there has been a common trait that you can say these leaders have.
I think there's a few common traits for female entrepreneurs in cannabis. I think one of them is tenacity. You have to be tenacious. You have to be determined. You have to pick yourself back up every time they rewrite the regulations or change the rules, or you need to make payroll this month and you can't get a loan or a line of credit from the bank. You have to be flexible, and you also have to not give up. You have to be resolute in your why. Like, you really have to understand why you're here and not get swayed by that. I think the other common trait I see is just the desire to help people. Yes, it's easy to read headlines a couple years ago and be like, we're going to make $1 billion, and that's going to attract a certain type of entrepreneur into the cannabis space. But I'm not seeing that the women or the people of color that I interviewed are focused solely on that. They see the opportunity in cannabis, but it's not just dollar signs for them. They see an opportunity to help people. They see an opportunity to support their communities or revitalize their communities. They see an opportunity to kind of repair some of the harms caused by the war on drugs. They see an opportunity to take care of their loved ones, whether it's their children or their parents or veterans, or there's just every day I think we hear like, well, cannabis could help with this too, and so there's just this really great way to take whatever you did before cannabis and
Mm-hmm.
apply it within the cannabis industry. And because it's still growing, opportunities are endless right now. I think the biggest thing that keeps women in the cannabis industry, though, is the desire to do some good in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think especially given all of the uphill battles of working in the space, because it's still federally illegal with the taxes, with 280E, with banking, insurance, all that stuff, I think it's critical that any entrepreneur, women, person of color, any entrepreneur has kind of that lens of, okay, I'm in this, yes, to make an impact. Impact could be dollars, but impact has to be something else. Otherwise, it just seems like a very hard industry to want to be in for a long time. You just get defeated quite often. You have to pick yourself up. You mentioned it, like, yes, I believe you're right. Tenacity is such a key trait. Mm-hmm. For women, so one thing that really was interesting for me when I was watching the film and just even preparing for this interview, I always think about gender equality, but in the film, you talk about gender parity. Could you let us know what's the difference between those two terms in your mind?
Yeah, so I think when we have these conversations about equity, fairness, justice,
mm-hmm.
these big concepts about how do we make the world work better for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. We end up having these terms and they're related, but they don't all mean the same thing. You know, they're not synonyms. So parity for me is basically equal representation. Do we have 50% women and 50% men seated at the table? You know,
mm-hmm.
and that's, I think, the first step towards all the other work we have to do. Like, do we have the people at the table that look like the country, you know, and do we have men and women and non-binary individuals? Do we have people from the LGBTQ community? Do we have people of color? Do we have veterans? Do we have people with different abilities and disabilities? I mean, like, that's what the world looks like, right? And if we don't have that representation, number one, we're not doing the work that we need to do on a company level. So how can you do that work in the world, right? And then deeper than that, we know that more diverse companies and more diverse boards end up being more financially successful because you don't all think the same way. So when you have an opportunity or you have an obstacle, you've got a greater opportunity to succeed and overcome those things. So it just makes sense to start with parity, right? Like, do we have the same number of people in the room? And from there, we can go deeper. So I wanted to make sure I have these accurate. So I actually looked it up ahead of time. So equality is treating everyone the same or giving everybody the same thing. So one topic people are talking about right now is an economic stimulus around the coronavirus. So an example of equality is everybody gets $1,000 because we're going into a potential recession. Well, equity is giving everybody what they need to be successful. Yeah. So maybe there's some people who need more than $1,000 because that's what they need right now. And then there's other people who they have 3 to 6 months savings and they're like, well, I don't actually need it this month, but let's talk next month. And that applies in all the different contexts as we can think about in cannabis and in the government and everything. So, and within that, I think the way we get to justice, like social justice, is we need to start giving everybody what they need to be successful.
Yeah, I agree. I remember hearing the difference because, you know, so many companies, and I feel like this is so now, like, come on, let's not say yes, diversity is the first thing, right? Parity, absolutely. But it really is true equity. And coming in the cannabis space, that's really when I fully understood kind of what that term equity meant. And making sure, I don't know if you've ever seen this like visual of there's 3 different people standing so they all could see the same line, but one person didn't need a box, one person needed a box that could get them a little bit up higher, and one person needed like a huge box. And that was a really good way for me to understand what equity is. And
exactly.
I think that companies, right? Like, I'm curious if you've been able to see this a little bit more since the film or even in the film, what companies are doing in terms of equity. Yes, we know about the social equity programs, but that was one thing I asked about. I did this panel in November, and I asked, what are your companies? And there was a government official, head of a pretty big cannabis company, non-plant touching, and then two other entrepreneurs. I was like, what are you doing to make sure that there are equitable roles for women? And I don't think they knew what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, with your lens, what are you seeing? Like, is that something that still needs to be a little bit educated, or?
Yeah, you brought up the idea of diversity, and I think that's a good segue to talk about inclusion, right?
Yeah.
So I heard this great quote, and I forget who said it, but I heard it in Diversity and Inclusion Summit hosted by Variety in Los Angeles last year. And it was, diversity without inclusion is tokenism.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a way for people to be included, they're just sitting at the table, well, then that's tokenism. Like, this has to be integrated into absolutely everything that your company does, everything that your state does, everything that your community does, if we want to talk about inclusion. And that's where I think that's the next place we need to go. I think we've had the conversation like, okay, yes, we need more diversity at our company, but what are they doing once they get there? Do they have the same opportunity? That's where we get to, are we treating everybody the same? So we can go from parity, okay, everybody, we have enough people in the room, to equality of like, okay, we're treating people the same, but then you need to get to equity, which is everybody has what they need to be successful. And that's part of being a good manager, a good leader, right? Like, or a good teacher. If one kid knows how to read and the other one doesn't know how to read, you don't give them the same book, and say, good luck. You give them each what they need to be successful. And I think we need to start applying that elsewhere. As far as who's doing that well, it's challenging in the US because state by state, community by community, things are still very different. We don't have federal regulations on this, and so everybody's kind of figuring it out as they go. What I've seen is that the states that have voted since 2016 have had the conversation around equity and justice in the legalization effort. I think Washington and Colorado, when they legalized in 2012, or voted to legalize in 2012, and then it became legal after that, they just wanted to stop locking people up, right?
Yeah.
And they wanted to be able to transition from a medical program into an adult use program. So it was whatever we could get through and then prove that it works. And I think the states after that have, if they've done a good job, they've tried to learn some of those lessons and say, just legalizing it doesn't solve the problems. We need to make sure that it's fair in how we give licenses out. And so they're having these conversations about fairness and justice, but like, are they treating everybody equally, or are they giving everybody what they need to be successful? And
exactly.
So the states,
I think that's the learning curve.
Yeah. And some states are still working on it. Massachusetts had the first social equity program that they legally voted on, and that was in 2016, and it was just this year, 2020, that they finally got everybody on board, and that first social equity company was able to open. So it's too soon to see whether they've been successful or not, but they got one, they got one through. So all eyes on them to see how it works, and we're certainly rooting for them. We want them to be successful, but they had to do a lot of work on the city level, on the state level, and just say, this is how we implement this. So we're coming from a place of equity. We're coming from a place of justice.
Yeah. And I think being in the cannabis space, you always feel like it's dog years, right? And then you think about the evolution of how laws are changing, how we're looking at things, and you think about that's actually a really short amount of time to actually see some pretty substantial change that hopefully can impact other industries in the future. And so I think you're right. Like, sometimes I'm just like, we need to get to the green light right away. And it's this progression to see what actually worked. Okay, how can we change this? Because, working with governments, it's not working with industry. It's different paradigms, different objectives, different risks. And actually seeing that, and I'm excited to see kind of the success that happens in Massachusetts, because I'd spent a lot of time in California, and we'd highlighted a few things about how even just launching some of the social equity programs didn't actually seem truly like they were executed equitably, from the actual allowing people to apply for licenses and all of that stuff. So I think it's important that we watch the best states do it right and see kind of what can happen. I'm curious just about going from where we are in 2020 and when you started doing your initial research, when you started your film. And it was something that you wanted to talk about, so I'm really excited to really get your insight. You mentioned that cannabis had a 37% of women leadership in the industry and kind of executive leadership. And that, I believe, was in 2015 or 2016. And then it looks like it declined. I remember in 2017 and in 2018, a few stats went down were released, and it looked like that number had dropped about 10%. And my thought, and I think a lot of people wrote about, okay, well, that's the, influx of capital, and a lot of new people are coming into this space. And then I was shocked and surprised to see a report that was released in 2019 that put that number up again to around the 35 or the 36% mark. And I'm curious what your insight is from when you started getting into the cannabis space and really looking and researching this until today, this podcast interview. What are you seeing? How are you seeing women leaders evolve, or this percentage increase or decrease? What are you actually seeing?
Hey, Cannabis Business Minds. I wanted to invite you to a special opportunity to be part of the Cannabis Business Minds Mentorship Program. This is a 12-month program where you will get to ask questions and get advice, gain different methods and strategies, and improve key skills as an entrepreneur, all while gaining a different and fresh perspective and expanding your network and community. If you are looking to take yourself and your business to the next level, apply to join our mentorship program today.
How are you seeing women leaders evolve, or this percentage increase or decrease? What are you actually seeing?
Mm-hmm. Well, those were the statistics that I've seen as well. It was really interesting to film throughout 2016 and early 2017. And it was actually a couple months before we had our film premiere for film festivals in the fall of 2017, where that study came out that 27% of senior leadership in cannabis was women. And at the time, I really felt like, well, that's what happens when we have big states like, Massachusetts and California legalize, and it's this influx of capital has come in. Because sadly, there are certain startup business models in place in this country, and that got applied to the cannabis industry. So we've got this model where, okay, you're a startup and you may not have had a bank loan yet, but you need to move your company to the next place. So you go to angel investors or venture capitalists, or you enter pitch competitions and things like that. And we know that over 96% of funding through the traditional startup method goes to straight white men. Less than 2% goes to women, and less than 1% goes to people of color. And that got applied onto the cannabis industry, because those were the people who said, well, I know how to fund startup companies. Let me start looking at business plans for the cannabis industry, right? So you basically have straight old white men giving more straight old white men money. And so if you didn't have those relationships, or if you didn't have an MBA from an Ivy League college or $1 million of your own in the bank, like, how are you going to compete, right? But I think taking a step back from that, what I also realized around that same time is that the statistics that we were hearing probably weren't all that accurate. this is kind of like an opt-in survey that a magazine was doing.
All right.
I don't want to be too casual about it, but it's the same idea of like if Cosmo had you do a quiz and they said this is the favorite sex position that all men like, would we believe it? Because it's a magazine that did an online quiz. So we have to have a little bit of take it with a grain of salt, right? Like, is that the number? And so the way my work has actually transitioned now is there is a women in cannabis study that started in the fall of 2019. And it's the first international longitudinal study looking at the professional experiences for women and non-binary individuals in cannabis. And they are working with academic researchers who do this for a living to design the survey, and they're going to analyze the results and share their findings. So that to me feels like we're going to have a better lens into this, and they're currently, as a minimum, trying to get 1,000 respondents. And as of now, I think they have over 800. So I think it's just a matter of time before we get some of those preliminary results. But that was really exciting for me because that's exactly the type of research I wish I had. If I could go back in time and have that kind of level of research in 2016, I could have changed the conversation in the film slightly because I just would have had more information, right? But looking ahead, I think was a great opportunity to continue interviewing and documenting women's experiences in cannabis. So I've actually teamed up with their founders to interview women and non-binary individuals. And we're going to have a digital release strategy for the videos that supplement their research findings. So we can make it more accessible.
Oh, I'm so excited for that. That'll be very, very good. And at the end, I'll have a little plug for like where people can find you and where people can find that. Yeah. And remind me, is this focused on women leaders or women entrepreneurs? Because I feel like there's a difference there, right? Being a business owner, being a VP of marketing is a little bit different. How does the survey, does it look at both or one particular?
It actually looks at professional experiences across the lifetime of someone's career in cannabis. So it can be everything from a founder and a CEO to, somebody who's working in a lab testing to make sure things are safe, to your bud tender who's actually selling something at the dispensary. Like they're trying to show that spectrum, and the reason they want as many respondents as possible, and 1,000 at a minimum, is they want to be able to start looking at these different groups. Because what we think is that while there may be some trends for the whole group, it's going to be interesting to see where the differences are from group to group. And I think what we're going to find is there's going to be some differences when we start looking at big things like harassment, discrimination, bias, bullying, things like that. So as an entrepreneur, you may experience those, but if you're the founder and the CEO, you might have more agency or more opportunity to be able to say, well, I'm not going to take money from this person because I don't like the strings that are attached. I'm going to, find my funding elsewhere. But if that's a day-to-day struggle for you in your work environment and you're lower on the totem pole, like you may feel more stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just so fascinating because, you think about, there's this term when you think about corporate governance called tone at the top. And so what's like you have a business owners and then, or a board, let's say if it's a public company, and then you've got the C-level managers and the suite, and the C-suite, and then you've got the managers, and then you've got kind of the frontline employees. And what happens, I mean, you saw it with Uber when the guy was ousted, you've seen it with MedMen, you've seen it with so many companies, is when at the tone at the top of the organization is one that doesn't allow for people to have agency, doesn't have a true HR department, doesn't talk about what's the difference between diversity and equity. Then you see that trickle down from the C-level to the manager and then to the frontline employee. And it seems that in general, cannabis businesses lack, probably because of the history of being in an illicit market for quite some time, really, until this, past decade, the proper governance and the proper structure to make a sound ecosystem, unless the company was started by business owners that put that at the very beginning of, really led with that in their mission. Mm-hmm. Because I'm shocked when you hear about people's issues with harassment and people's issues with just sexual misconduct. It was interesting. We polled for one of my women's summits, the first one. We focus a lot on kind of building confidence and really kind of diving deep into your why. And once you kind of figure that out, you can negotiate better, you can resolve conflict better, all of that. And I was surprised to see from our stats that most women that came didn't feel like they were being taken seriously, mm-hmm. which is just interesting. So seems like there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's true inside the cannabis industry and outside of it. You mm-hmm. look at these conversations we're having as a culture around Me Too and the Time's Up movements. And I think it was shocking for some of us to go, wait, the women at the top still had to deal with it? Or they had these situations where they felt uncomfortable and they couldn't speak up. And we're finally going, well, what about the people below them and below that and below that? If they're feeling like this, how does the production assistant feel? Or how does the background extra feel? Or the makeup person or the craft services person? Then you look at other businesses. It's like, well, if the CEO feels that way, what are the bud tenders feeling? What about the delivery people? What about all these other things? And I think you're right. I think part of it is there's some bad habits or maybe just ignorance, because the cannabis industry started illicit market, and has moved to a legal, at least on the state level, market. And there's probably some training and knowledge that needs to be gained by the founders of those companies now to be like, oh, wait, health insurance, HR, protocols, like the general stuff. Whereas before you didn't keep any books because you didn't want anybody to see them, right? And I think part of it is just we're all sensitive beings. We've all been brought up under patriarchy and we just have these biases. So, there was just a study released. They asked people globally questions that led towards bias for men and women. And 90% of the respondents around the world have unhealthy bias against women. So
what?
Exactly. We have so much work to do, whether it's just, I don't think that person's telling the truth, to I think they're going to lose money, or or they're just not going to be a good leader. When you look at that, and then you see all the microaggressions that women deal with on a basis, and it's like, well, no wonder we don't feel like we're taken seriously, because we aren't most of the time. I still feel that way, and I have 3 documentary films under my belt. I still feel like, I walk into a room and people already are making assumptions about me and the level of my work.
Yeah, well, because also, you just think about human nature. I think first impressions are made in the first 3 seconds of getting to meet somebody, and usually that's all nonverbal. Mm-hmm. And so if there's already a preconceived kind of bias that happens, there's a lot of education that needs to happen. And I suppose I was going to ask you, before we get into, something else, is what if somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, am I doing this at my organization? How do I make sure that I don't apply that lens? What kind of insight do you have from the research that you've done, the books that you've read, or even your own experience, that somebody, just one small step that somebody could be doing to check themselves, or to make sure that they can kind of not be in that 90%, because that's not a good percentage to be in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just asking the question is the first step, right? Do I have bias, or was that a biased reaction? Why did I do that? That's part of getting woke, right? It's just doing the work internally. You have to analyze yourself, your actions, your thoughts, and then start digging into, okay, well then how does that apply? How do I apply those thoughts or those feelings in the real world? And is that the type of person I really want to be?
Yeah.
So I think it all starts on the individual level. And when you have, a company who promotes that kind of self-reflection and mindfulness, I think you can build on that.
Yeah.
Some companies aren't large enough where they need to have like a diversity and inclusion task force, but some companies are. So that's an opportunity. But again, even on that task force, like, are you going to give them any weight behind their findings to institute some changes? And who do you put in charge of that? If you're going to put a straight white guy in charge of your diversity and inclusion task force, maybe you haven't done the work you need to do yet.
Yeah. I was working with an organization, and we had diversity training and equity training and even disability training. It was such a fantastic organization outside of cannabis. And, even when hiring, it was, we always took kind of this equitable lens. But it's interesting taking an equitable lens and then not having a lot of guidance kind of what to do if somebody doesn't qualify for a job, but you really want to make an equitable place. And so, even working with a team that was so focused on that, I could see that there was so much struggle still. So I think that, and we had one person that worked there that was so great, because every meeting they'd say, are we looking at this through an equitable lens? And so just to kind of emphasize what you said, yes, the first thing is just check yourself in any kind of business decision that you make or anything, if it's equitable. And I think everybody could do that, Windy. Like, we would move pretty fast if people could just apply that to a business decision.
Well, I agree. And if we foster just that level of questioning about our motives in our companies, there are still leaders who don't want to be questioned. They want to be surrounded by yes people. And so if that's your company culture, you're probably not going to get very far. Or sadly, it's going to take something really negative happening before people wake up and start changing. But I think just having the conversations is important. And what I'm really excited to see is, once we have the data from this women in cannabis study, just having conversations about it to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? Like, I think that's going to be a fascinating discussion we get to have this year, because we'll be able to see some international trends as well as different social groups.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, data is science, and data also tells a story. And so as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, I'm really excited to see what happens, and also follow the people who end up taking the information to heart and implementing it in different ways. I really feel like I'm called to help tell stories of women doing this work in the cannabis industries. And I'm honored every day that they let me help tell their stories and share their stories. So I want to stay in and help doing this as long as possible. And so I think the Mary Jane's film is just the tip of the iceberg. I would love to be able to turn this into a docu-series, turn this into, maybe it's a part 2 of the film, maybe it could be all these different things, right? But the fact that we're still having these conversations, I think is really powerful. And it just shows, again, the tenacity of the women and the people of color in the industry saying, like, nope, we're here and you can't push us out. Yeah. There's room for us at the table. We brought our own chairs in case you didn't bring one for us,
Yeah. Oh, and I just think about the impact that it can make once you've got the data and you can turn this into a series, and you can have these conversations and really, start training and teaching and making that movement, continuing to evolve the movement in a different way that could give it much more momentum and all of that. So I'm quite excited. Before we get into the speed round, I wanted to see if you had any other insight that you really wanted to share just about some of the uncovering of your documentary. We touched a little bit on social equity We definitely dove into women. I know there were two other pillars: sustainability, environmental sustainability, and medicine. You also kind of highlighted in your film. Is there anything, just one thing that you wanted to make sure that the listeners knew about?
I think one of the other trends that I've seen, and it still holds true to date, is there's still work to do. And we know from looking at other startup businesses how to fix it. And it comes down to two things. It's funding, so it's access to capital, and it's mentorship. Like that's how we can fix getting more film directors. That's how we can fix getting more female entrepreneurs. That's how we fix getting more people in the cannabis industry, right?
Yeah.
So my advice to people is continue to have those conversations, and then do whatever you can to help solve those things. You know, if you're in a position where you can help create a fund for women and people of color in the cannabis industry, start that fund and have a fair process for the way people pitch to get access to that fund, right? You can help people write business plans. If you can help them craft their pitch, whatever you can do to help them be successful, that's your social equity work. And then the other side of that is, from a mentorship perspective, if you do look around the room and see that you're the only woman or you're the only person of color in the room, reach back down the corporate pyramid and bring some people up with you. Because be that advocate, even if it's uncomfortable. Like, I remember having a conversation with other filmmakers around the Me Too movement, and there was just this question of like, well, what do you do if you see something? And I raised my hand and I said, a well-timed not cool bro is a great way to call it out. You know? Hey, not cool bro. Like, somebody saw what I did. We need to change something. If we see something, say something, call it out as you feel safely, but a well-timed not cool bro is kind of my go-to as needed.
Yeah. And you know what I've learned? I think it's maybe just being married to a Frenchman and like with the Socratic method, I used to take so much offense to it. He'd always ask me like, why did you say this? Why did you do that? And it was never in a way to make me feel bad, but I think as an American, I just felt weird when I was questioned why. But I've also noticed that a good tactic, and it's truly out of like, if you don't understand maybe why somebody said this, it's a good way to educate. Again, it's with tact and it's a good tone of like, but why did you say that? If it's appropriate, right? You always have to read the situations, but it's hard, but you have to be a little bit brave doing this kind of stuff. And I like the not cool, bro. I think I've got to practice that one a little bit more. I've got to practice that one a little bit more. All right. So are you ready for the speed round?
Yes, I'm a little nervous, but I'm trusting that you're going to treat me equitably, right?
Oh, you know it. I don't change these questions too often. So it's all equitable for sure. What is one piece of advice you would tell somebody just getting into the cannabis industry? Just start. I think if I can explain a little bit, I know it's the speed round, but I think women have a bit of fear, or they're waiting to be invited to do something. And you just have to have the confidence of a mediocre white man and just start. Like, if you have an idea, put out your hand, introduce yourself as doing that, because you're going to learn a lot more by testing it in the world than if you wait to be invited to do it or have your entire plan and then launch it, right? Well, maybe somebody beat you to it. Yep. I think the CEO of LinkedIn said, if you waited too long to launch your product, you've already waited too long, or something like that. I think I butchered it. But yes, you got to get going, get traction, especially in this space. All right. What is your why?
So I'll tie it into my personal mission statement. So I produce cinematic and immersive experiences that promote peace, justice, and equality. So if there's a way for me to do that in the world, it can be a film, it can be a podcast, It could be virtual reality someday. It could be theater, but that's why I do what I do.
Yeah. Was there a moment in your life that made you have that why? Did you wake up one day and just realize this is kind of, I want to change something, or?
So I actually watched a video where somebody created a formula for you to draft your personal mission statement. And it combined gifts plus passions plus values.
Oh.
So my gift is storytelling. My passions are cinematic and immersive experiences. And my values are peace, justice, and equality.
Oh, that's excellent. Oh, I love it. It's always good also to get some templates to be able to articulate that. I realized that, we have that deep down and what we know exactly what we want and why we want to do it, but having something to kind of take that out of us sometimes and guide us to tell that, to make or break, really, when you think about pitching yourself or doing anything. All right, last but certainly not least, where do you think the cannabis industry is heading?
Currently, I think it's going to continue to... Yeah, right now. You're asking me like in the middle of a global pandemic. Well,
tell us, Windy, tell us.
Like my crystal ball says, so sadly, I think we're going to just kind of slump along for a bit, at least in the United States. I'm not feeling like people are all that adventurous to take a leap on a new thing. Currently, this could change in the next 6 months, right? But I think we'll probably, kind of do business as usual. I mean, I'm really proud of the organizations and businesses that are still staying open to provide services for patients and consumers right now. They're putting themselves at risk, just like, the people working at grocery stores are putting themselves at risk every day just to keep food on the shelves, right? That's what these cannabis companies are doing for us. So I'm really proud of that. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the fall of 2020 in the U.S. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think my magic 8-ball says people are ready for some kind of change. I just don't know if we'll get the leadership on the federal level. And that's what it's going to take. I feel like we're at the tipping point for states. Similarly, for the marriage equality discussion, we had a critical mass of states say this is legal to the point that the Supreme Court finally jumped in and said, like, yes, it's legal.
Yeah.
I feel like we're very close to that in cannabis, where if it's not going to come from a president and it's not going to come from Congress, it's going to come down to the Supreme Court saying, okay, it's unconstitutional. It's now legal. Like, you can't keep this from people. You got to stop locking people up. But, it all depends on what happens in the next couple months. So,
yeah.
I mean, I'm sending detective vibes to Ruth Bader Ginsburg for sure, and everybody else. So.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I realized I was like, well, that's a really hard question for anybody to answer right now because there's so much uncertainty. But I hope that there's some interesting stuff, and there's definitely. I think you're correct about if there is going to be a sweeping movement, it would be Supreme Court. How it's staffed is interesting, but thank you. And I guess first I would love to have you back on the show because this was a lovely conversation about a few things. We didn't get to hear about your entrepreneur story and all of that. So before we kind of wrap up, how can our listeners find out more about you? And do you have any interesting things that you want to share with us before we let you go?
Yes. So the best way to find me and the film is going to our website. It's maryjanesfilm.com. And the full name of the film is Mary Janes, The Women of Weed. And we are at Mary Janes Film on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So that's a great way to just follow what we're doing. I'm really hopeful that we will have details on the digital release of the film so that way people who haven't seen it are able to see it. Unfortunately, right now, it's not the best time for community screenings. So we are trying to make it as easy as possible for people to watch the film at home and stream or purchase it. So as I have more
Yeah.
details, we'll be announcing that on social media.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again for joining Cannabis Business Minds.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Cannabis Business Minds, for tuning into this episode with Windy Borman. This is Simone Samaluka Radzins reporting to you from the south of France, and I hope that you can take a few gold nuggets from this interview. We talked about so much. We talked about equity. We talked about parity. We talked about really finding your why, something that I ask almost every guest. I love what Windy said. She said values, passion, and what you're good at. How do you mix all of those things? Well, if you are interested at all in sharing that with me and with the Cannabis Business Minds community, make sure that you head on over to our Facebook group, Roadmap to Success, and check out the website where you'll be able to look at the mentorship program and a lot of other good stuff. So until next week, hope you stay safe, healthy, and empowered.